Hey folks, today's episode is brought to you by the good folks over at Boulevard Carroll Entertainment, one of the country's largest full-service production companies based in New York, D.C., and New Jersey. The rehearsal facility in Manhattan alone is over 17,500 square feet. If you're an artist looking to take advantage of these services or a tech who's looking to join an extraordinary team, check out boulevardcarroll.com. Link in the show description.
What's up, roadies? My name is Larry Milburn, and this is Roadie Free Radio, your VIP pass to meet and greet the stars behind the scenes of the music and film business.
Okay. What is happening, roadies? Oh my goodness, it has definitely been a hot minute, but very first and foremost, a gratitude-filled, happy Thanksgiving, as us vegans say. Happy Thanksgiving to all of you out there listening. I hope you are well, and my thoughts are with all of you. Guys, I don't even know what to say, man. I put out episode 150 with TJ Hoffman several weeks back. Thought I was going to take 1 week off, and all my client work just stacked up because the year end was coming and people were like, we want our stuff now. And I just got sucked into the black hole of work and deadlines, and I apologize for the void in episodes. There's a lot to catch up on, and I will save it for a catch-up episode that I will do next week. But suffice it to say, we've got the Black Bear Festival still to talk about. We got to talk about AES and my great time I had there. By the way, if you want to see some of it, head over to the YouTube channel for Roadie Free Radio. You can find tons of video stuff that I've recently put up there about AES. We've got NAMM to talk about. Going to be doing another panel with some great people at NAMM. I'll tell you more about that in next week's episode. And so a lot of amazing things happening. The biggest of which I should tell you is that, this episode is not coming from the barn. I am back on my couch in my living room with a massive bandage situation splint around my left ankle. Many of you know that this past summer I had toe surgery, and I was putting off the ankle surgery until next summer, hopefully, but the pain was sort of building up a lot quicker than I thought, and I had already blown through my deductible, so I figured, hey, let's go under the knife one more time. So about a week ago, I went in for surgery again and had my ankle operated on to fix up some torn cartilage in the ankle. So I'm back recovering on the couch. Can't really put any weight on this foot for a week. So this thing's coming off in a few days. And then I go in a boot, more crutches, rehab, the whole deal. But those of you that have reached out wondering, hey, man, where did you go? Haven't seen an episode in a while. Are you okay? I am okay. Thank you. Thank you for checking in. I appreciate it. It is always a welcome thing to hear from you guys. And I'm okay, man. It's all good. It is all good. Hopefully this is going to help get my feet back together, and we're going to keep it going. Also want to let you know, starting this Friday, Black Friday, I am running all the way through New Year's a big sale in the merch shop. 50% off everything in the store at roadiefreeradio.com. Hit the merch button and you will see all the great stuff that we have. So from Black Friday all the way to New Year's Day, 50% off when you use the code ROADIE50. That's ROADIE50. Good stuff. Got to move the merch. Get it on out. Start fresh in 2020. If you've ordered a t-shirt recently, just know they are coming. Working out a few things. So there is a delay in getting t-shirts, but you can place your orders and we'll get them going. So I want to jump right into this episode. This is the Michael Bloomfield event that I did, also celebrating Paul Butterfield. For those of you just tuning in, Michael Bloomfield was a third cousin of mine. I never got to meet the man, but his legacy and his life and playing and whatnot certainly had a big effect on me growing up and my family. And I am celebrating this new book, Guitar King, Michael Bloomfield's Life in the Blues, with David Dan, who wrote the book, and Sandra Warren, who executive produced the film Horn from the Heart, the Paul Butterfield story. And I had this event about a week and a half ago in my hometown here in Washington, Connecticut. And it was amazing. The turnout was great. I was certainly shocked by the number of people that showed up. I didn't quite think Michael and Paul had that kind of fan base here. And it was just really, really cool. So what you're going to hear is basically the event. There are some film clips that we put up, and you'll hear the audio from that. A lot of question and answer type stuff. I did not have a mic out in the audience, so it's going to be tough to hear some of those questions. My mom actually asked one of the first questions because she grew up with Michael, and so it's a little tough to hear that. I apologize, but hey, we're going to do more of these things. We're going to tighten it up. We're going to get it better. Overall, the thing sounds pretty good. We did have one small glitch in the beginning where we didn't catch my intro and a little bit of Sandy's first thing. So in a minute here, I'm going to tell you more about that and what we were talking about as we got the show started. But this is Born in Chicago, the life and times of Paul Butterfield and Michael Bloomfield. Again, we were celebrating the new release of Guitar King, Michael Bloomfield's Life in the Blues by David Dan, which he has set out to create the definitive biography of Michael Bloomfield. And here's the best part. I never got to finish the book before the event. So while I've been recouping here on my couch, I have been plowing through this book, and it is unbelievable. And it's just a great read. It's a fun read. It's informative. It's a great little encapsulation of the 60s and early 70s and the music scene and what was going on and Monterey Pop and all these amazing events that happened back then and where Michael Bloomfield stood in all of that with guys like Clapton and Hendrix. So if you are a fan of the blues, if you are a fan of music at that time, I highly encourage you to check out David's book. I also encourage you to check out Sandy's film, Horn from the Heart, the Paul Butterfield story. I did not ever go down the Paul Butterfield road too deep because I was always obsessed with Michael and his life and his playing, but I watched both films back to back, Sandy's film and then the film that I co-produced that I've talked about on the show, Sweet Blues, a film about Michael Bloomfield directed by Bob Sarles. And these guys, man, well, you know what? You're going to hear us talk about all this kind of stuff. But I do want to say that in the show notes on the podcast page here at roadiefreeradio.com for this episode, I put a bunch of links for, a bunch of albums, for some of the books, for David's book that you can get, just all stuff about these guys that you can find. So head over there, check it out, have a look. Grab something, you're gonna get a sale too if you go there and you head over to the merch store. Anyway, head over, check that stuff out if you want to grab some Bloomfield, Butterfield stuff. I think you need it in the rotation. All right, so here we go. I want to thank really quick the Judy Black Memorial Park and Gardens for hosting us at this event in Washington, Connecticut. I have to thank my buddy Shane Monger from Washington Depot Production Services, who lent me a beautiful 70-inch flat screen monitor that I could use as a reference and we could put these film clips up. I also want to thank my friend Tanya for helping out with the sound so I didn't have to think about too many different things. I got to thank the Hickory Stick Bookshop, who brought over books that David could sign. He sold most of the books that they ordered right there on the spot. It was super cool. They also have a fantastic music book selection. If you guys are ever in the Litchfield County area in Connecticut, check out the Hickory Stick Bookshop. You must do it. Finally, I would also like to thank Bob Sarles, who has graciously let me follow along on the incredible journey that he set forth years ago, trying to capture as much footage, documenting the life of Michael Bloomfield in interviews and photographs and whatnot. If you guys don't know who Bob Sarles is, I did an interview with him several interviews back. You can go back and find it. Bob Sarles, the rock documentarian, has some great films out there. He's a great director. And without him, man, I would not be on this part of the path that I have found myself on. So with that, I would like to take you back to the 1960s. I'd like to take you back to the crossroads of race relations, the crossroads of folk music and blues and rock and roll, and how electric music came out and took the world by storm, and how these guys, Michael Bloomfield and Paul Butterfield, were certainly at the forefront of that journey. What we were talking about in the intro that got cut off, unfortunately, was the first time that we all, Sandy, David, and I, when we were younger, the first time we heard Paul Butterfield or Michael Bloomfield and what that meant to us. So as we come into this, you'll start hearing Sandy's story, and then, of course, David's, and then we are off to the races. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoy this event. Don't forget, next week I'm going to do a big host update catch-up episode, and I'll let you know everything that's going on. Until then, happy holidays, happy Thanksgiving, and I love you guys. Here we go.
Hit it. Call yourself a roadie. Call yourself a roadie. Call yourself a roadie.
Folk 65, I think it was called, right? And it was all folk songs, Patrick Sky and maybe Fred Neil, that gang. And the last two tracks were Butterfield. Born in Chicago is one of them, and I forget the other one. But they just blew my mind, and I started to leave the cult of folk music purists. And then as I got a little older, got into college in New York City, I used to go down to the Village and hear the Butterfield Band. It was the five-piece band with Michael every time I could. And so that was a big part of my growing up musically, as a music fan, not a player.
I'm jealous. You saw the original band, 4 or 5? Wow.
Not the 4-piece, but the 5.
The 5-piece. Wow. So that was before Mark Naftalin. Or maybe it was 6-piece.
No, Mark was in...
It was a sex at the time.
There was originally 4 without Mark and without Michael.
That was the first Butterfield band,
Yeah.
yes. And then Michael joined, and then Naftalin later.
Yeah.
Well, I was a little bit older.
You can tell you just finished the book because you've got the dates and the times is ready, right?
If I get obnoxious, just tell me, hiss or something. I can't help myself after all these years of working on this project. But like many people my age, I first encountered Mike Bloomfield with the Super Session record. That's the record that pretty much is well known for Michael Bloomfield. Al Cooper and Steve Stills were a part of it as well. But I saw the record at the local Five and Dime. They had 3 or 4 racks of records, and I pulled it out and I said, this is really, wow, that's a cool cover. Look at that guy, he's got big hair, and that guy's got more hair than the other guy. So I bought it, took it home, and I listened to it. And in particular, the first side had all these songs that there was no words to them. There were no lyrics, and that was something completely new to me. And it was sort of hard to hear where they started and where they ended. They were just kind of they're just instrumentals. But the more I listened, the more I said, wow, that guitar guy is doing something really interesting. How does he do that? And listen to that. And then I saw in the Boston Globe, because we had just moved to the Boston area, my family moved it from Chicago to Boston, that Super Session was coming to town. They were going to play a concert. And I was new in town. I didn't know anybody. So I said to my Mom, there's this band I want to go see in Boston. Will you come with me? And so my mother was, she was a 60s housewife, but she also had done negotiating with the Black Panthers when we lived in Chicago. So she knew a little about, alternative modalities. And so she drove me into Boston, and we saw Super Session. And there's Bloomfield up on the stage. He's this tall, skinny, rangy guy with massive hair, and he's like a noodle. He's like, he's playing these solos, and he's wiggling all over the place. And I was sure he was going to fall off the stage or fall into the drum set or something. But he managed to stay upright, and he played just this amazing music. And after that, I sought out Butterfield and Dylan, and of course the Electric Flag, and all his other recordings, which were many that he participated in. And through Michael, I discovered Paul, and tried to teach myself harmonica and guitar, as so many other kids did. But that was what got me started, and here I am today.
How long did it take you to write the book?
The book was about 10 years in process. So.
And I met you 3-4 years ago at the Maine Jewish Film Festival.
Yes, that's where we met.
Right?
Yeah.
And you were into the book, and I feel like at that time you said, "Oh, the book's going to come out soon." It was still another 4 years to go. You set out to write the definitive Michael Bloomfield biography.
I'm not sure I had that in mind. I just was going to write a history, and it
It's
just
like 80 pounds.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
It costs a fortune to mail.
Right.
Oh, right.
What prompted you to write a book about Michael in particular?
Well, for people who appreciated Michael's artistry when he was with us and active, it just seemed odd that after, a decade or so after his passing, no one knew who he was. And I tell the story that when I would be at a party and people would say, "Oh, what are you working on?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm writing a biography of Michael Bloomfield." And the response almost always would be, "Oh, is he still mayor of New York?" And so this seemed to me to be wrong. It seemed that people should know who this guy is and what he did for American popular music and for bringing together, as you pointed out, Larry, cultures that were, disparate musically, certainly. And that's really what I thought that needed to be addressed. So that started me.
So you went deep. You went real deep. You're still in it.
I'm defining deep, I'll tell you, man.
Yeah.
Just,
Sandy, what about you? What prompted you to make Horn from the Heart?
It's a really number of things happened to coalesce at the same time, but I retired from sort of full-time working in 2010, and I'll skip to the executive summary. I happened to hear a show at what's now Daryl's house in Pauling, New York. It used to be the town crier, and it was called Butterfield Revisited. So I had seen it in one of their promos. I said, this should be interesting, with somebody named Gabriel Butterfield. Turned out to be Paul's son, his first son. And we went, and I brought my old Butterfield records with me so he could sign the covers, whatever. So we met Gabe, and one thing led to another, and I don't have time to tell you the whole story, but we ended up hooking up with John Anderson, who was recommended by Corky Siegel, another Chicago harp player, to direct the film. And it was sort of like, you start thinking, oh, this is just, I can help out a little bit. And you get, your toe in the water, and then it's like, oh, they need some editing, and they need this, and they were going to need to shoot a zillion interviews on the West Coast. And it just sort of went one thing after another till I was completely drawn in and committed. So we started shooting, we researched for about 6 months and started shooting the first interviews at, I guess, the very end of 2014. Most of them were during 2015.
For both of you guys, what was like the biggest surprise for you in your journey? And who was your favorite interview?
Oh, well, I think one of my favorite interviews would be a guy named Jerry Pasternak, who no one knows, but he was a high school friend of Michael's, and he sort of was drafted into one of Michael's many high school bands. His first band got him in trouble because he played a forbidden encore on stage at a talent show when he was a sophomore. He was almost expelled for that because it caused pandemonium in the audience. The entire cast of the show came out on stage and was dancing and being teenagers, and took a long time to clear the stage and get people back to where they were supposed to be. That was Michael in high school. But he also spent time playing down on Rush Street, which was the entertainment district in Chicago at the time, with lots of adult nightclubs and bars and various other activities not for teenagers. And Jerry Pasternak was a 13-year-old who played drums in one of the bands on Rush Street in one of the clubs. And he got Michael involved in playing down with the band, and then he told me some incredible stories, many of which did not make it into the book just because I was a little concerned that some of the people involved in them would disapprove. But that was a fabulous interview.
Volume 2.
Yep, it's for the director's cut, yes. But he was, I knew about him, and it took a long, long time, maybe a couple of years, to find him. And I finally did find him living in a house trailer out in Arizona, and we had wonderful back and forth conversations. It's just a great interview.
Sandy?
It's hard to pick one. Each person we talked to had obviously different experiences to talk about and different takes on things. But I guess if I had to, the two that come to mind first are David Sanborn, who he was so thoughtful. I mean, he's funny. He's really funny, and very incisive and insightful. And the other one would be Marshall Chess, the son of Leonard. Son of Leonard. He really had thought a lot about Butterfield and his journey through music and life, and he was just amazing.
Surprises for you guys in your journey? Something that you weren't expecting?
Well, I think one thing that surprised me was that Michael's father, Harold, had Michael committed at one point in his teenage years. Michael had been kicked out of New Trier in his junior year for showing up drunk at school for various reasons, which I go into in depth in the book. But Harold decided that the one thing that he needed to do to get his young son in line was to send him, which I guess was not an unusual thing to do with so-called juvenile delinquents, sent him to the lockdown ward at Northwestern University Hospital in downtown Chicago. And so Michael was there for a period of time. He couldn't wear his street clothes. He had no shoes. He had to attend therapy sessions on a regular basis. He was under observation. Just what you would imagine would be the case, but he was also in there with people with, serious mental issues and drug problems. And just hearing about that told me, it gave me sort of insight into some of the things that later bothered Michael, that were difficult for him.
Was that during high school?
He was a junior in high school when that happened. So that was quite a surprise, and I had no idea that had happened.
I wonder how he would have been dealt with today as a teenager with those issues as opposed to then.
Well, it's interesting. I talked to the head of psychiatry at Rutgers University, who's a Bloomfield fan, and he got in touch with me for other reasons. But he did sort of an analysis of Michael. He said, please don't ever publish this because I've never met Michael, but just an armchair. He said, today, Michael would have been considered ADHD, something like that. He would have been, he seemed to think that Michael wasn't bipolar. But if you talk to Alan Bloomfield, Alan will say, Michael's brother, Alan will say, without a doubt, Michael was bipolar. And he also felt that their father was bipolar, but high functioning. So, but the head of psychiatry at Rutgers told me that because Michael hadn't been hospitalized except for that one time, it was probably not the case that he was bipolar, but they would have certainly have medicated him today as a child and teenager because he was very hyperactive. He talked fast, he moved fast, he was constantly going here and there, and that was one of the reasons why he became so good so quickly on guitars, because that's all he did all day when he wasn't in school, and he wasn't in school a lot of the time. He just played guitar. So today he would have been treated much differently, I think.
I want to jump ahead a little bit to their relationship, Michael and Paul's. And for those of you that don't know, Paul Butterfield is the only person, as far as we know, who played Newport, Monterey, and Woodstock. Wow. And now is also in the Hall of Fame. It's pretty awesome.
Rightfully so.
And I'm going to play a little clip from Sandy's film of these guys and of some early stuff of them at Newport and beyond, I believe, right?
Bloomfield came from a wealthy family, and one of his uncles had a pawn shop, and I used to not have any money, so I'd get my guitar as cheap as I could. I'd go to the pawn shop. And I went to one on Clark Street one time, and this kind of smart-ass looking kid behind the counter, and I said, "Can I see that guitar?" He hands it to me, and I start playing my little blues licks, a few of them, He said, "You like blues?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Give me that thing." He starts playing Rings Around the World, just playing all these fancy licks and stuff. I said, "Oh, wow, that's great, He'd get in your face and he'd just be spitting on you while he was talking and stuff, He was just, he had a tremendously active mind and really intense about everything he did, not just the playing, everything.
Michael was always intimidated by Paul. His personality was so strong, and you really couldn't get underneath Paul and get to know him well. He really didn't let people in that much. Just his presence alone was a tough guy. Black leather jacket, a beer drinker. He was like a blues man, the real deal.
See, I had never worked with Paul for a long time because I never figured we'd get along personality-wise, because Paul's a very, very hard guy, period. Just a hard individual. He's very rock hard inside his body and everything. He has completely taken that harmonica and reworked it. In my opinion, Butterfield is the finest blues harmonica player in the world. And this is the first gig I've ever worked with Paul. And I tell you, man, you hear this band after this 2-month tour, there won't be a blues band in the history of the world that's going to come near this band.
I met Bloomfield on the Highway 61 sessions for Dylan. And he told me as we got friendly that he was in Paul's band. And that was one of the reasons why he didn't want to tour with Dylan, so he could stay in Paul's band. He said, "You'll make all kinds of money and, be on the cover of Newsweek." He said, "But I just want to play the blues." He says, "And I'm having a great time doing it in this band." He turned down Bob Dylan to play with Butterfield. It's about as good as you can get.
Bloomfield used to do a fire eating routine. He'd do that. He'd get one of these things like looks like the mallet you play the kettle drum with, and he'd squirt lighter fluid on it, light it up, spread his legs out, and that groove would be going, behind him, and he'd lean way back and eat fire. And those old stoned out hippies would just lose their minds.
Any stoned out hippies in the room right now? Who just show of hands? Anyone get to see Butterfield Blues Band or Michael Bloomfield out there? We got one, John Peden in the back. Nice. All right, a few of you. Where? Memorable stuff from those shows? You remember where they were?
Fillmore.
The Fillmore.
Mr. West.
West. Yeah. The Fillmore. Auditorium. And Newport.
And at Newport.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's.
Afternoon show ends with Bob that night.
Nice. Wow. Let's talk about that a little bit. We were talking before. I mentioned it. It always seems like the Dylan part of Newport overshadows the fact that Butter and Michael played in the afternoon and whatnot. But that was a big deal too, right? Just to have this rockin' electric Chicago band there was...
Yes, it was a very big deal. In fact, that was, at least until Bob's performance, that was the news at Newport, was that a band with electric instruments and drums was going to be on stage at the folk festival. Muddy Waters had played at the jazz festival, and he played with electric instruments and drums. But as Sandy said, folk was a pure music, and it was generally an acoustic music, almost always, not played with drums, very rarely. And to have this bunch of young white and black kids come from Chicago to play this loud, obnoxious music, it seemed like rock and roll, and that just didn't seem to be appropriate for a folk festival.
The devil's music.
In a way, yes, correct. Inauthentic. The Beatles had happened not too long before that, and that was what rock and roll was. It was guitars and drums, and pop music had electric instruments from the 50s, but not the authentic music, which was folk music. That was something pure. And so here was the taint of, as Michael later said, greasers getting it on, having a wild party, boogieing. And that wasn't exactly what Pete Seeger's idea of folk music should be.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about these two guys. Is this shot from around that time? Right?
That's from the actual festival.
That's from the festival. Yeah. So at that time, 65, who are those two guys?
Well, the guy on the... What you want to address this, Sandy? Do you want to talk about it? I mean, talk about Butterfield, and I can talk
Butterfield had just gotten a contract with Elektra to record. Paul Rothschild, one of the guys who worked for Elektra, had come to Chicago and heard him, and actually he was the one that kind of encouraged him to bring Michael into the band during that trip.
That's true.
That's true. And he had just signed that. He also, there's a great story that his brother tells, that Paul Rothschild had come out, decided to sign in the band, and this band was playing locally in the clubs, eventually in the north side of Chicago, but they never really had aspirations to be a national, international, top band. I don't think it ever occurred to them this could happen. So all of a sudden this is happening. He opens his mailbox, and there's his Elektra contract and his draft notice. And that was very, very frightening at that time. And there's a whole long story about how there was a window when there was a marital exemption from the draft. And a very dear friend of Paul's who worked as a barmaid in the club, I think it's Big John's where he was working then, was very anti-war. And she said, look, we're going to get married. You're not going to go to Vietnam. You're going to go on with your career. And you have to agree to this. So they did. They got married for that reason.
And they had Gabe.
And they had Gabriel.
And we're grateful that they did. I mean, that they got married, because...
Imagine, yeah. So that's so anyway, so he gets, at some point, I think it was the guys, it was Jack Holtzman, who was the founder of Elektra, wanted Paul to have somebody representing him in negotiating the contract. So he recommended Albert Grossman, to be Paul's manager. He was also the manager of Janis Joplin and Peter, Paul and Mary and Bob Dylan. So he comes to Newport, on the heels of all of that. And Albert, of course, was there rounding up all his people. And I think, I'm not exactly sure how it came to be that Peter Yarrow is the one that appeared before the board of the Newport Folk Festival.
He was a board member.
He was,
yes.
But what inspired him?
So was Grossman.
Yes, Grossman's one of the founders of the festival.
That must have been the connection, because he got up there and convinced the board very late in the game to add the Butterfield Band as one additional act, and he had to sort of convince skeptical board members that this was the thing to do. Well, there's a long description of that by Joe Boyd in our film, and so I think this was maybe the first big, gig for the Butterfield Blues Band.
Outside of Chicago, obviously. Yeah, this would sort of break them to the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And who's Michael at this point?
Well, Michael started at Big John's in 1964. Brought electric blues to the north side, and when he left Big John's, it was Paul that he convinced to take the job at Big John's, and Bloomfield's band, called The Group, because nobody really had a name for it, had kind of broken the ice and brought this really high energy, loud, raucous party music to the north side, which was largely folk clubs at the time. You know, folk music was predominant. And so they were very successful, and they kind of made the scene at Big John's, which prior to that time had been sort of a nondescript bar on Wells Street in Old Town. But when Butterfield arrived, Butterfield had two guys out of Howlin'Wolf's band, Jerome Arnold on bass and Sam Lay on drums, and they just tore it up. I mean, it became a massive scene. And meanwhile, Bloomfield had gone north to a place called Magoo's up in Bryn Mawr, way up north, and it was reputed to be a mafia joint, and they were paid very well, but there was nobody there. I mean, you know, the guys moving the stuff in and out of the back of the storeroom were busy with other things, not paying any attention to the music. So when Rothschild, as you said, Paul Rothschild, producer for Elektra Records, showed up to hear Butterfield on Fritz Richmond's recommendation.
In the Kettle of Fish.
Yeah, that's right, yes. And
Trivial Pursuits.
And Butterfield said, well, you know, there's this other guy who plays good electric guitar. Maybe you want to check him out too. So right away, Rothschild said, get that guy in your band. Let's put them together. You know, and Butterfield said, well, no, Michael has his own band and he's doing his own thing. And by that time, Bloomfield had a contract with Epic Records that was basically going nowhere because they were looking for another Dave Clark 5 group, not what Michael was doing.
This was the deal with John Hammond,
that was
Senior, yeah?
With John Hammond, the producer, yes, exactly. So the two guys you see in the picture here weren't really friends, though they look very friendly. As you heard Michael say in the clip, the interview clip, you know, he wasn't too comfortable with Paul because Paul was very serious and very hardcore.
Very hardcore.
Yes, about his blues. And he saw Michael as this sort of whiz-bang, showboating rock and roll kid who would come down to the south side with his crew of gaggly teenagers, and they'd all sit at a front row table, and when Muddy Waters wanted to go freshen his drink, Michael would jump up and play a few licks, and then he would leave. And Paul was living down there. You know, he lived in Hyde Park, which is on the south side, and he was working with Smokey Smothers in the clubs.
He was born down there, right?
He was born, yes. He was born in Hyde Park. Yeah, his mother worked for the dean of students at the university. Yeah. And so Michael had this amazing energy, and Paul had this extremely powerful sound, and the two of them together were just like a match and gasoline. They just would light the place up. So they were the perfect combination, but despite the fact that they looked very jovial and friendly, they didn't quite get along that well.
Some people said that Michael was afraid of Paul because he was so hardcore. And so, you know, Michael grew up going to good schools, even though I guess he was in and out of them. But still, they just, you know, he was afraid of him. He's, you know,
he
went
said
into
as
the
much,
pit, carried a gun. Paul, he was the real Chicago blues guy.
He was the real deal.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, that for not really getting along or not being as jovial together as this, that Michael chose to stay with Butter and not go on with Dylan or to wherever else he could have gone.
Yes, that is interesting. Well, I think, as Michael said in interviews later, that he really knew that with Bob, because Bob was really a big star at that time, he knew that he would have to defer to Bob's presence, and he wouldn't be able to move his fingers as much as he would like to, as he said. And with Paul, the whole deal was Michael was the soloist. Let's go, you know, play. So that, I think, was very compelling for him. And even though Bob was the superstar, and he really liked Bob, he felt better with Paul.
Didn't he hate to travel also?
He grew to hate to travel very much, yes, particularly, and they had it wasn't quite like today where you play a set or two in one place and move on to the next. They would be for 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month, in one location, so it wasn't as bad. But by the time they had done their English tour, Michael's really had it with the band. He couldn't sleep. He had a hard time slowing his mind down enough so that he could actually go to sleep, and then that became really a difficulty for him.
And the cockiness and the confidence that you see, that first clip of him sitting there talking out in the field or whatever it is by that fence, that was the first footage that I ever saw as a young adult filmmaker when I met Bob Sarles, the director of Sweet Blues, who lived up in San Francisco. He had me come up and we went and did an interview with Nick Gravenitis, who wrote the song Born in Chicago. And he said, you got to come back to my studio and see some of the footage that I have. Because I had met Bob thinking I was going to do my own documentary on Michael. And about 20 minutes into meeting Bob, I realized that was the biggest mistake I could do, other than supporting Bob to get his film done. Because Bob's story, just so you know, if you can find Sweet Blues, it's part of a box set called From His Head to His Heart to His Hands. I believe it is available on Amazon, and it's part of a box set. It's 3 CDs of music, and then Sweet Blues that Bob directed. And he makes rock documentaries. So in any other documentary or interview that he did with people like Bob Weir or Jerry Garcia, whoever it is, he would throw in questions about Bloomfield and Butterfield just to sort of build his own story. So, and he started acquiring all this footage, and the first thing he showed me was the young punk Michael Bloomfield, and I was blown away by the confidence. And then the next thing he showed me, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, a couple hours ago, was like a 1981 version or 80 version of Michael, not doing well in Italy, I think.
Yes,
soon before he died.
Yeah, performing for a group of Italians who expected to hear Super Session, because at that point that's how everyone knew Michael. And Michael was instead banging out 50s rock and roll tunes on a piano and singing off key.
Yeah.
Did not go over well.
And I had the same reaction to that as I did watching your film, Sandy, at the end with Paul playing piano. And that is that both of these guys dedicated their lives to the authenticity of the blues, the authenticity of being bluesmen. The myth of signing your soul away at the crossroads. And this is what this is it. It got them there, and when you hear them and you see them both play at the end, they got it in a sad way. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, do you know what their relationship was like toward the end in those later years, as they were both struggling to make ends meet? Paul, in your film, and we're going to show some more clips too, but in your film, there's that wonderful section about how life is great in Woodstock, and it's home, and he's mowing the yard, and he's going on tour, and the band is growing, the American dream, exactly. And then you flash forward later to sort of a desolate house, and that was Michael also in Mill Valley, right? Living kind of like a recluse.
I was going to ask David if you know if Michael ever visited Paul in Woodstock. I didn't hear that from...
The producer, John Simon, told me that there was one time when Michael was in Woodstock, but he wasn't very clear on it. Uh-huh. But I'm sure that if he was there, he would have dropped by to see Paul. Yeah. But I could... their contact basically was... The last time they were together, I think, was at the Greek Theater in San Francisco when they played Chet Helms's Tribal Stomp in 1978, I think it was.
78.
I think it was 78. Or 76?
It was Fathers and Sons. I should know.
Fathers and Sons was
Chicago.
1969.
Oh.
So that was much earlier. But that was, as far as I know, the last time that certainly the last time they played together musically. So.
Fathers and Sons, at that time, they'd still be friendly. And
absolutely. And they were both on the circuit. Michael was not playing, not touring nationally, but Paul certainly was and had his band. And they played the famous concert in Chicago that was part of that 2-record set that featured Muddy, of course, and Paul and Michael were a very big part of that performance, and it was very successful.
Yeah. It's just amazing again, and hopefully you guys will buy the film and you can see, and buy both films and you can see the end of these and where these guys went, because they did so much for the guitar, for the harmonica, for the blues, and for race relations. Tell us a little bit about what that meant at that time, 65, in America, to have an integrated band.
So, Paul grew up in Hyde Park. He really was colorblind. He grew up in black community. He loved the blues. Obviously, he used to go into the clubs underage and just sit. He'd be the only white guy in the black blues club and just gazing at the musicians. And eventually, they did let him come up. Here's a great piece in the film that Sam Lay talks about. One of the first times he saw them say, "Hey, come on, this white boy, have him come up here, see what he can do." And he went up there, and everyone was just like amazed how good he was. But I think a lot of people make a big deal about the fact when he formed the band, it was he hired 2 fellows from Howlin'Wolf's band, and Howlin'Wolf was on tour in Europe at the time, so it wasn't like he stole them. I mean, in the sense that they were needed at that time, whatever. But so he had the first interracial, nationally recognized band. I don't know if that's literally true. You think that's true? And people made a big deal about that, as if I don't think from Paul's point of view he thought he was making a statement. Kathy Butterfield talks a little bit about that during her interview, about how she just thinks that's emphasis is wrong, because for him it was not like a big deal. It was the natural. Yeah. They were good musicians, and he wanted them in his band.
He picked the best musicians, and
I
think it just never occurred to them that this was a big deal. But when they appeared at Newport, they were one of 3 only since the festival started in 1959. One of the 3 integrated bands that appeared at that place, and Newport, of course, was a hotbed of liberalism and progressive thought, and certainly supporting civil rights and all that. But bands were either white or they were black. Very rarely intermixed.
When they started touring, issues came up in certain places they went to where they wouldn't let, they didn't want Jerome and Sam to stay in the same hotels or eat in the same restaurants. And then Paul decided, the hell with that, we're not going there anymore. And he limited where they weren't touring in the South, even Florida.
Is it Lee in the film who says that his dad says, "We won't go where you can't go"?
Well, Billy Davenport said that.
Yes.
That was the reason why he decided to join the band, because he was very hesitant. Because
after Sam Lay got sick, the drummer was Billy Davenport, and he was worried about being in a touring band. And I think it was maybe the narrator says, but Paul said to Billy, "Where you can't go, we won't go," and that kind of clinched the deal.
Yeah,
with him.
Unreal. Let's take a look at a clip from Sweet Blues, which will give you a little bit of a flavor of Michael's beginning and whatnot as well.
I was 13 years old. My cousin had gotten a guitar, and I was just jealous of him and wanted one too. I was left-handed, and I learned right-handed, and it took me a year to get over that. By the time I was 15, I was the best I knew, or that anyone around me knew. I was a monster.
Mike Bloomfield was a musician that I met in 1966 when he was a member of the Butterfield Blues Band out of Chicago. He came to play at the Fillmore. Through the passing of time, he became very important to me. Michael and Butter and some of the other musicians that I met in the mid-60s were really my teachers as far as who influenced their music and who they thought I should also bring into the Bay Area. The predominantly white audience that came to rock and roll shows. And Michael, because of that constant nervous tic that he had always had somebody that was pushing it. If it wasn't the Staple Singers or Albert King or B.B. King or Howlin'Wolf.
Michael was a great mentor who has directed us to a lot of the individuals out of that Chicago scene. And I think as a result, we were, between Bill and I, we resurrected the careers of a lot of, at that point, somewhat obscure black artists.
Well, he was one of those disciples, if you will, that said, I listened to B.B. King. He was one of those super guitar players that the kids liked. And I think that they felt if Michael Bloomfield said, he listened to B.B. King, we'll listen to him too.
The best thing about Bloomer's guitar playing was he had a great technique and a deep background in a variety of musical forms, and he really had a good control of his instrument. But the best thing about it to me was that he was fearless.
With an acoustic guitar, a Telecaster, Stratocaster, or a Les Paul, you hear three notes, you hear one note, and you knew it was Michael.
It's hard to put into words, you know, it was just an instinctive thing. He had it.
On stage, when we first saw him, he was totally wrapped up. He was one of the earliest guys I knew that didn't seem to be aware that he was even there. You know, other people would be, their eyes would be open and they'd be checking the place out. And his eyes were always squinted shut and perspiration pouring down his face, and he'd be holding his guitar up here like this and squeezing these notes out, and really would capture your attention that this is a man who loves to do what he does.
When he first came to San Francisco, for some reason, he befriended me. Now I had started to play with the Jefferson Airplane. I'd never played electric guitar before, really. And he was one of the first guys that showed me how to do stuff, that took some time to show me how to bend notes and to feedback and sustain things. And I was really thrilled because in those days, as Jack has mentioned sometimes, some of the East Coast genre guitar players were very guarded about their secrets and the way they did stuff. I knew guys that used to turn away from me when they played things so you couldn't see how they were doing. And he was a really sweet guy, brilliant guitar player, and was really instrumental in getting me into being an electric guitar player.
Michael set, a standard for guitar players. If you're gonna be a lead blues guitar player, you better know what you're doing.
And if you look on the internet or anywhere with guitar players, they mention Hendrix and they mention all the top guitar players. And you look down the line, you see Bloomfield listed at 45 or something like that, which I think is a shame because I thought he was better than Hendrix or Clapton. Myself, really, as far as just the energy and the sweetness of his playing.
Michael, shit. Man, that guy was unbelievable. And his posture was amazing. He was like a noodle. The way he kind of bent himself over his axe. He doesn't have a guitar in his hand. He's got fingers which meld into a guitar. He's not playing his instrument. He is the instrument.
Music, fashion, trends are cyclical. As the late 60s gave way to the big rock stars and rock stardom and Zeppelin and over-the-top shows and whatnot, some of these guys kind of drifted. The blues, pure blues like this, sort of took a back seat for a while. Then rock stardom gave way to punk music, and then new wave, early 80s. By that point, we lost these guys. There's a piece in your film, someone says, if you just hung on, right? Who says it?
David Sanborn.
Say Sanborn again,
said,
right.
You know, he was talking...
Sanborn said everything that I liked in that film. It was awesome.
He was talking about how, you know, there came a time when blues wasn't, you know, selling, and there wasn't a whole lot of interest. And he said, you never know that if you lay low and you wait, you know, the world turns a few more times, the zeitgeist changes, and you never know, you end up in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So it's sort of like if only Paul could have hung in there, but not like he made a decision not to, but anyway.
Do you think Michael would have stayed, or was his temperament and his were his demons a bit stronger to keep him out of it?
I think that's the latter is more the case. In 1978, he had just recorded an album with a group called KGB, and it didn't work out well. It was a band of supposed superstars with Rick Gretsch and I forget the other players, but John. No, that was earlier. No, that was Triumvirate.
Yeah,
that was earlier. But so it was Rick Gretsch and the drummer from Vanilla Fudge and a number of other players. It was produced by MCA, which by that time was, you know, the company that put out Elton John and had many high-end pop acts, and I don't know what they were doing with Michael, but Michael gave an interview shortly before the record was released with the Los Angeles Times, where he basically trashed the entire thing and said it was a scam, and he only did it for money because he in fact owed a lot of money to the IRS, and they were going to take his house if he didn't do it. So and this was published, and he later regretted being so candid about it. But MCA said, you know, this guy is done. Forget it. He's poison. We won't touch him anymore. And that was fine with Michael because he went off with his friend Norman Dayron, and they issued a number of records on small labels, some of which were better than others. But I think by the time he passed in 1981, he had really... I think he was tapped out. He would have continued to play music, undoubtedly. He would never have returned to the heights of Super Session in the 60s, and maybe Paul was similar in that regard. I think for Michael, he had found what he really liked in music, which was all kinds of music, not just blues, but he was characterized as this guitar god, blues guy who had recorded with Al Cooper, Super Session with Butterfield. And that really wasn't who he was by the late 70s. He liked to play piano, so he would play a set of piano. He liked to play acoustic guitar. In fact, when he was invited by the Newport Jazz Festival, which was by that time Newport in New York, 1975, and he played the first concert in the festival series, which was called Midnight Blues. Also featured Bobby Bland and Muddy Waters and I think B.B. King. Michael opened the show, and it was at Radio City Music Hall, and he walked out onto the stage, and if you've ever been there, it's a huge Art Deco stage with a great, huge awning over it, and there was a little chair there, and he sat down in a chair, pulled out an acoustic guitar, and began to play these recreations of Blind Blake tunes. And meanwhile, the place is packed with 5,000 people, and they're expecting Super Session. And so this was where Michael was going, and it was not what people expected to hear. And the only thing they knew about him was that he was the guy who in 1968 recorded this great record, and they all loved it and knew it well, and they expected that. But that was not what he gave them. And more it became a real problem. And more he was less interested in doing stuff to please the audience and his managers and his record company. He was just going to play his own thing. And so I do think that whole guitar god thing was pretty much done for him, had he lived.
what do you think his impact on the guitar was, the electric guitar?
Where do we begin? I mean, really, fans of Michael Bloomfield know that he really was the first guy to stretch the limits of what we consider acceptable in pop music as, guitar. Prior to Michael Bloomfield, you had Duane Eddy and a few others who were twangy guitar players, and they would play instrumentals, but their tunes would be 2 minutes long, 3 minutes long, formulaic. They would have a recognized melody. They would be a little improvisation in the middle. Generally, guitar players were incidental to the vocalist. So in pop and rock and roll, the guitar or soloist, whoever he was just there to liven things up, and then the vocalist would come back in, and that's who you were there to see. After Bloomfield, you were there to see the guitar player. I mean, it didn't matter that Bloomfield couldn't sing. It's what he played. And that, I think, is, there are other musicians who were doing the same thing, particularly in England, Clapton, Peter Green, and some of the other players, Jeff Beck, certainly. But Bloomfield at stateside Bloomfield was almost before any of the English guys, because the Rolling Stones issued their first record in '64, and whatever you think of their playing, they weren't really blues players, and they were a rock band. They were singers. Mick was a singer, and Keith played a little bit of electric guitar, but wasn't a soloist in the jazz sense of being a soloist, which Michael was, very much so. And Paul as well, very much so. And that, I think, is the impact that both these great artists had on the music. Was after Newport, if you were a serious guitar player, you had to be able to solo. You couldn't just play chords and have a nice voice. You had to be able to solo. And you had to be able to solo as well, or an approximation of Bloomfield. And I think that really changed the landscape and gave birth to endless, guitar players who soloed way too long and too frequently. But that's where it started.
Or bands that used the Wrecking Crew because they didn't have
because they couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And what about Paul on the harmonica?
Well, people do still say that he was the greatest harmonica player ever. And just judging anecdotally by the emails I get just from our website from harp players all over the world who just go on with these amazing, either they saw them or they listened to the records, but how inspirational and how creative and how, just all over the world. Got a guy in Argentina, been writing back and forth. There's this guy in Canada who's like the best harp player in Canada, Carlos Del Junco. And they're just, so I think that it was a big impact. But it was that plus the bands he put together, because he just had a great knack for bringing the best people together for the sound he was looking for. And then he let them play. He didn't have everything charted. People, and then I think bringing that rough and fierce, Chicago blues sound to Newport and then elsewhere was an amazing game changer in pop music. And then, by the time of East West, he was already, you listen to that record, it's a combination of traditional blues tunes, Morning Blues, one of my favorite tunes, but then he goes into East West, which is very jazz-oriented and has a lot of, Eastern tonalities in it and whatever. And then he was off wanting a horn band. Right after that, he's, I want it, and he put together an amazing horn section. Mm-hmm. But that was before Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and he didn't, if he had been more commercially oriented, he might have said, hey, my first two records sold really well, I should do another one like that. But he didn't. He was following his own, what was driving him musically, and that was the way it was going to be.
Yeah.
It became jazzier and jazzier.
And it's amazing that Michael sort of followed the same path with the Electric Flag.
Yes.
They both had this love, not only for the blues, but then it branched into just American music.
That's true. And certainly in the last days of the original Butterfield Sextet, everybody, Elvin and Paul and Michael, were talking about getting horns for the band. So that was something that was in the air. And of course, when Bloomfield debuted the Electric Flag at Monterey, the summer of '67, Paul was there with a horn band as well. And so where Paul was sort of playing blues, though, and Michael was really trying to make pop music. He was playing blues as well, but he wanted to incorporate all the various aspects of American music into what the Electric Flag would be. It didn't quite turn out that way because it became a first-rate soul band after Buddy began to assert himself. Yeah, the Electric Flag, but...
There's a great scene at Monterey where Butterfield is doing his set, which was really well received. And there's a scene of Michael off stage, grinning ear to ear, just loving it. And so there was no lingering hostility, apparently, because he had recently left the Butterfield band. But he's just like, in rapture at listening to Butterfield's set.
He was scared to death because Butterfield sounded so good. And they came on after Butterfield. Yeah, he was a little worried that they wouldn't go over so well, but they did.
While we're talking about the impact of these gentlemen on their instruments, I thought it fitting to show this clip. And if you were wondering, this is not actually Michael's guitar. This is the stunt Telecaster that was brought. Our very own John Peden here, who's with us tonight, is also a guitar enthusiast and fellow podcaster, and directed this little piece that I wanted to show with G.E. Smith, who I also had the good fortune to interview for Sweet Blues, and who is a huge Michael Bloomfield disciple, along with Jimmy Vivino. And Jimmy was very instrumental. I don't know if you don't know who Jimmy is. He's Conan's band leader and plays in the Fab Four. He's a monster player, and was instrumental in getting Gibson to reissue a Bloomfield Sunburst Les Paul, down to every last detail that he could possibly find. And he owns the number 6 prototype. And we attempted, David and I, to get not only that guitar here, that Les Paul here, but Michael's actual Telecaster that's in Rhode Island, as well as having G.E.
No,
Smith
actually, no, it's in Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. Yeah. Oh, even closer. We could have gone to get it.
I suppose so.
You actually offered to go drive and pick it up, but we didn't do it. So instead, we have G.E. Smith and Michael's actual Telecaster that G.E. is playing for the first time.
Whoa, there it is. Mike Bloomfield's Telecaster. What a neck. We know from Dan Erlewine's forensic work on it that it's April of '63, I believe he said, and that the pickups, and it looks to me like maybe this whole plate here, and the controls, yeah, it's a later toggle switch, later knobs. I think this plate looks later. It looks like that late 60s chrome. Everything comes from 68 or something. The bridge pieces are changed too. Sure looks like April of '63 headstock to me. The neck is fabulous. Really good. It's a little thinner here than I thought it would be. I don't even know if it's a full 1 11/16. It feels like 1 5/8 to me. It really drops off at about the 4th fret here. It
really nerdy guitar stuff. Yeah.
Thinner. I don't think it's been cut down. That looks original. That finish looks original. It doesn't look like it's been messed with. Let's plug it in.
You see where the strap is on the lower bout? That's pretty weird.
Let's see. That sounds like him. Woo! It has that Not every Telecaster does that thing. Only the really good ones where you can really dig into it and it snaps right back up at you. I probably listened to this guitar more than I listened to any recorded guitar that you can think of. I've listened to this record probably a couple thousand times. I mean, I lucked out and got this when it first came out. It just changed my life. Bloomfield's playing, the way these guys look on the cover, I mean, everything about it. There's a picture of Mike on the back playing this guitar before it had this unfortunate cutaway, of course. All right, first song, Born in Chicago. Second song, Shake Your Moneymaker. Give me a break. Nobody can do a record like that now, you know? He does this great thing. He slides down on the low E string. The song's in E. He slides down on the low E string and goes. Then when the band goes to A, again he goes. While they're playing the A chord, he stays in E, you know? Forget about it. Back to E. Then when the band goes to B, he goes. Whoa, go on, baby, go on, back to school. Come on. I think I learned that chord, that sixth thing, you know, which it can sound sweet or it can sound nasty, like Bloomfield did it there. You know, Bloomfield would switch in the middle of a solo. He'd be. He'd go to that rhythm pickup. That's that sound. And then, of course, later, I listened to this a lot. We all heard this. There's probably very few people that were alive in the United States in the late 60s that haven't heard this guitar. Because it was on all these, it was on like a Rolling Stone. You know, I mean, powerful stuff. Because I remember in the summer of 65, riding on my bicycle down to the playground in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. We're listening to Like a Rolling Stone playing out of the speaker by the swimming pool. And we're going, I don't know what that is, but it's the greatest thing I've ever heard. That's this guitar is on there. Listen to the songs on this record. Tombstone Blues, from a Buick 6, one of my favorite Dylan songs. Ballad of a Thin Man. This guitar. Highway 61, this guitar. Crazy. Michael Bloomfield, guitar. His name comes right after Bob Dylan, guitar, harmonica, piano, and police car. Michael Bloomfield, guitar. Thank you very much. This guitar is the guitar that he was playing with Bob Dylan at Newport. The famous Bob Goes Electric moment. It's this guitar. You see those pictures? There he is up there. You know, this guitar, you know, at Newport on these records, a very, very important guitar in American 60s musical history. I can't think, to me, of a more important instrument for what got played on it. This instrument in Bloomfield's hands played music and changed things. This was incendiary. This was explosive. It was angry. It was frightened. It was everything. It was everything that the late 60s was. I mean, you could say, okay, it's a shame that this stuff's been done to it, and it is, but I see no reason to doubt, knowing what we know about where it's come from, I see no reason to doubt that this is Mike Bloomfield's guitar.
his guitar. Don't you think?
Thank you, John, for doing that. You, John, you know GE pretty well. You know him by George. I know him by GE. Not quite as close. I've only met him a few times, and the first time I met him was to do those guitar lessons that he did for Yorma's thing.
Yeah.
And it was something that Bob Sarles, the director, again, sent me to go do. And he got permission that I could ask GE some questions about Bloomfield in the middle of this lesson he was going to do. And I think you lent him a 52 Telecaster to play, or a broadcaster, something like that. So we take a break. He's doing the lesson, and we take a break. I just remembered this, watching this thing. And I kind of went up to him, and GE's definitely a hero as well. And I said, GE, I've got to ask you these questions. And as I'm talking to him, he reaches in this little bag, and he pulled out a switchblade, and he pops it open, and he starts cleaning his fingernails with the switchblade. And I didn't know if he was doing it to intimidate me or what it was. He was great. He was awesome. And then he folded it back up after he got them nice and clean and ready for the next set, and put his switchblade away and answered all my questions. And great guy. And clearly,
Thoughtful guy. I'm sure
he gave me the nuggets. Absolutely. Yeah, he did, for sure.
that was completely unscripted.
That. Yeah. I'm sure he must have just loved holding that thing and seeing it for the first time, right?
Just put him in the room
Yeah.
with the guitar and turned on the canvas.
Nice. Well, thank you. Yeah, definitely a good amp. And thank you all for nerding out with us on that video. Real quick, I want to get to questions before we do. What do you guys hope, Sandy, for your film, David, for the book? What do you hope audiences take away from these labors of love that you've put together for us?
Well, my first hope is that audiences get to see the film. Getting it out there as broadly as possible is not an easy task. And there are people still in like Australia who are writing me like the only way they can see it now is on Vimeo, and or they can order a DVD from Amazon and pay all the shipping and customs and stuff. Anyway, so my hope is that it gets out there as much as possible, and that people who, like you said, you would ask people if they've ever heard of Michael, and they'd say, is he still mayor of New York? I mean, so few people remember or ever knew who Butterfield was, and I think his legacy, hopefully this film will, he won't just disappear into the dustbin of history, to use a cliche, then that people will recognize his greatness and importance to the progression and evolution of rock, blues, electric blues, and other music.
Ditto for Michael. That's exactly my intent, is to put his name out there and have people know what it was that he did and how he affected the music and continues to affect it to this day.
Cool. Questions from you guys? Mom? How was Memory Lane? Pretty good?
Very good. I do have a question, because you clearly have been involved in Michael for a long time.
You could tell, could you?
Yes, and I grew up with him, and I was struck by a lot of different things. He was obviously very complicated. He had a difficult childhood. His father was a thug, honestly.
A stalker.
My mother and his mother were first cousins, and we were near each other. I've often wondered if he had had a more supportive...
There aren't many of me here, but I thought I might see Judy.
Oh, good. There's George. Okay, hold on, honey.
Are you here?
And then, and so I've often wondered if his childhood had been different, if his family had been more supportive. I wonder if he would be here today. Look, he went through I know, because he was always over, he would be playing our piano, he adored my mother, and which was great. And we had a lot of music in my family, both from opera, she was an opera singer, to rock. My brother was a really excellent guitarist. So I wonder if he would still be here today.
Did his family recognize that he had a special talent?
Not at all.
Oh, his mother did.
His mother, Dottie did. Dottie did.
Father break all his guitars at one point?
He told that story, but I'm not sure it's true. But well, I wish I had talked to you before I had finished the book.
This is volume 2.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I did. This is George, ladies and gentlemen.
That's my dad. He's.
Do you think? No, he had no support. His father was horrible, and his mother was lovely but very weak, and and they certainly didn't understand his talent at all. But my family did, but his family, which is why he was always over, but his family did not.
Well, I think that was very true. He was over your house, obviously, and other people's houses to play the piano. But they had a piano in the Bloomfield household, but he was not allowed to play that because he tended to be rough with instruments. But he was a rebel. He was different, and I don't think that even with a great deal of understanding, he still would have swum against the current. And he was, you knew him, I did not. I only got to see him one time. But over the years and all the work that I've tried to do to document his career and his life, he seemed to me to be someone who was not like other people and would never be like other people. And that was one of his great gifts, but it was also one of his great problems, so.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Great job,
oh.
By the way. Not knowing him, you've done an amazing job.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
I'll
definitely.
pay you after the...
Yeah, right. Where can you see Sandy's movie? You can buy one right behind you, right over there. Right on that table.
So we were in theaters last year and the beginning of this year, and now there's sort of odds and ends of remaining theatrical. Like we were just in Turner's Falls, Massachusetts 2 days ago, but mostly streaming and DVDs and Blu-ray.
Amazon has it, yeah?
It's on Amazon for purchasing or download, whatever they do there, streaming. And it's on iTunes and Google Play and whatever. It's on. If you go to our website, tornfromtheheart.com, it lists all the places. We're even on FiOS, which is pretty cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is high tech. Yeah.
About 3 or 4 years ago, for about a year or two, there was footage on YouTube of this public television show in Chicago in the 70s with Bloomfield playing with Junior Wells and maybe Johnny Winter playing with Muddy Waters, and then it's gone. It's gone from YouTube. Is that available?
It's available. It was the first PBS soundstage program called Blues Summit in Chicago. It was done in the summer of 1974, and it featured Michael pretty much running the band for Muddy Waters while guest stars came up, including Dr. John and Buddy Miles and Johnny Winter, as you suggest. And also Willie Dixon and Nick Ravenitis is in it, and Junior Wells is great in it. Yes, it was available from Shawnee, I believe, in VHS, but that was a long time ago. So now I think you can get it. Check Amazon. Amazon has everything, so you might find it there.
Anyone else?
Is there a backstory to that cutaway on telly?
Is there ever?
There is a backstory to the cutter. I'm going to let you tell it.
Well, I talked to the guy who owned that guitar and made that modification. His name was John Nuiz. He was someone that Michael met in Boston in 1965 when the Butterfield Band made its first appearance there. New East was playing with a guy named Graham Parsons, and they were trying to play country rock. They were working on developing that sound. And John had that Telecaster, and it wasn't, oh, I'm sorry, he had a gold top Les Paul from 1954 or so that he'd bought in Providence. And he didn't like the sound of it because it wasn't twangy enough like country music. And Michael had that, the Telecaster that he had purchased in Chicago the year before to record with Dylan. And as soon as Michael saw that New East had this gold top, he said, "I'll trade guitars with you." And New East said, "Great, a Telecaster, okay." So he took the Telecaster, gave Michael his gold top. The Telecaster had no case because Michael had purchased a case for it. So John New East said, "Man, it was all banged up and the back of the neck was filthy and it was just a mess." But he took it and he played it with Graham Parsons in the International Submarine Band for a number of years and moved out to California. One thing led to another. And instead of being a country rock guy, he became a heavy metal guitar player. And in order to play some of the bar chords that you need to play in that style of music, he needed to slide up high, but he was left-handed. So he flipped the guitar over and he couldn't get up high enough. So he told me with great pride, actually, he said, "I went down my dad's basement, my dad had a workshop, and I had this big bandsaw, and I just cut that thing right off, and man, I could get up on the neck, and it was really great. It was just the way I wanted." And he said, "I think that cut came out really well." And I said, "Yeah, it looked good. It's fine. It's really great." I said, "Did you keep the piece?" No, he didn't keep the piece. So that's the story behind it. And I believe the current owner got it from someone who was keeping it for John. John passed away 4 or 5 years ago. But that's the story behind it, and it outrages people all over the internet endlessly, and it's amusing to me because I'm sure Michael is up there somewhere snickering over the whole thing because he would think that was very funny, I think.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
So, what happened to acoustic folk after the introduction of the electric guitar festivals, etc.? It still survives.
It's still there.
Have it today. We
But it was quite controversial, as you might imagine, in 1965 when this happened. And but acoustic folk music lives on, very healthy, and yeah.
Sometimes with drums, though.
Sometimes with drums, yes. Folk rock, that's called, yes.
That's right. I want to give everybody a chance to talk to these guys, get a book signed, buy a film, buy a poster, support them. So we're going to go ahead and save the last 20 or so minutes of this for that. I want to thank both you guys, David and Sandy, for coming tonight, for being a part of this, and for all of your work to keep these legacies and memories going. And I want to thank all of you guys, like I said in the beginning, for buying the tickets, buying the records and the books, coming to things like this, and supporting artists. It means a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you guys very much. No roadies, no rock and roll.